Hello again. This is Mr. Smith with Honors Government and Economics. This is the third lecture for the first unit. Today we'll talk about federalism. Federalism is the system of power sharing that exists within the United States of America. In the Constitution, power is distributed between the federal government and the states. For the most part, a large amount of the state power comes from the 10th Amendment in particular, because it says that basically, any power not taken by the federal government in the Constitution automatically goes to the states. So, what is federalism? Once again, it is a shared system of government power between the federal and state government. The states, by the way, also have in their constitutions the ability to share power with local government. A unitary system is different. It's when power comes all from one place. So, for instance, in France, most power emanates from Paris. And as an example, the Minister of Education can look at his watch and tell you what elementary students are doing at 2 p.m. that day. So power and decision making comes from one place. Confederation is a loose alliance. It's a weak government. And an example of this would be the Confederate States of America. The president of the Confederacy, the illegal government that they had, Jefferson Davis, he had a hard time getting, for instance, governors of the states to go along with anything. When he would ask for troops to help protect the capital in Richmond, Virginia, governors from the deep south like Alabama and Georgia basically said that doesn't seem like it's any of our business. So they would refuse to send reserve troops. So a loose alliance. And this is the system we had under the Articles of Confederation, which is why it didn't make a very effective government. But this is all about intergovernmental relations. How do the different levels get together? How do they share power? How do they decide who gets to do what? And looking at this, of course, in the central government, you can see the unitary government holds primary authority, regulates activities of the states. In the Confederate government, limited powers exist within the central government, but in the federal government, the power is shared with states. In a state government in a unitary system has few or no powers. In the Confederate system, though, they have just about all the power. In a federal system, it's shared. And citizens in a unitary based country vote for central government officials. In the Confederacy, they vote for state officials. And in the federal system, they vote for both. So, which organized system does the government of the United States use? You have a federal system, but the reason why it's referred to as intergovernmental because they make such an effort to share as much as possible and includes a local government. But also for this question, if intergovernmental wasn't there, it would also be considered a federal system. The constitutional basis of federalism revolves around division of power, national supremacy, and the state's obligation to each other, which can all be found within the Constitution itself. The division of power, the states retained many powers. For instance, organizing local government and elections, whether it's school board or counties or townships or boroughs, all of that, for instance, is up to the government in Harrisburg. They set basically guidelines for that, and then the local governments can carry out their responsibilities. The states, of course, also have to ratify the constitutional amendments. 3/4 of the states have to approve. And they each have 2 senators in the upper chamber or upper house of Congress. So 2 senators from each of the 50 states. Some powers are denied to the states by the Constitution. Of course, we can't tax each other's imports or exports. And we certainly can't do that even with other countries. It has to be a national policy. We cannot coin money or issue paper money. That's up to the national government. And impairing obligations of contract, we're also not allowed to void contracts as state governments either. Individual rights, we're not allowed to grant titles of nobility, pass bills of attainder, which is a bill basically that punishes someone. Instead of having a trial, you pass a law saying this person is guilty of this crime and this is what their punishment is. Those are illegal. Ex post facto laws can't be passed, so we can't punish someone for doing something last week. We can't create a new law and then punish them for something that happened in the past. Slavery is no longer permitted by the states. We're not allowed to abridge citizens' privileges or immunities, and that's thanks to the 14th Amendment. Also, thanks to the 14th Amendment, states can't deny due process. The state governments and local police force have to follow the Constitution's Bill of Rights. We cannot raise or maintain separate military forces. We cannot not deny equal protection of law or impose poll taxes. Those would be a tax that you have to pay in order to vote. That's illegal for the states to set up. And we can't deny the right to vote on the basis of race, gender, or age, except, of course, below the age of 18. And, of course, this makes sense. States can't enter into treaties or declare war on their own. That would be a disaster because different states would be getting into all kinds of trouble all the time and dragging the rest of us with them. Federal obligations to the states. The federal government can't divide states. The federal government cannot tax interstate exports, so even they cannot basically tax trade between states. They must protect states against invasion, and of course, they all have concurrent powers and responsibilities. That is, powers and responsibilities are shared by both the federal and state government. Just because the national government does them doesn't mean automatically the states can't have those powers and responsibilities, unless specifically outlined in the Constitution. National supremacy. And in the Constitution, it does say in the Sixth Amendment that the federal government has supreme power. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. But obviously, in some leery places where it's been vague in the Constitution, or maybe a topic wasn't mentioned, the question is, where does the national supremacy on these individual issues go? So there's a lot of debate over that. The Supremacy Clause, once again, gives the Constitution the highest regard. The Civil War attempted to answer this question even further because obviously Southern states wanted the states to take a lead in most issues, but they lost. And of course, the struggle of racial equality proved that when it comes to civil rights, voting rights, other types of matters, even, for instance, frequenting businesses, state and local government had a lot of control over those things, but they did a poor job of it. Slavery, and then afterwards, the issue of segregation would continue to fall short when it came to state and local government. And once again, the 10th Amendment allows for any powers not taken by the federal government to automatically go to the states. The 11th Amendment also restricts lawsuits between citizens of one state and the state government of another. And of course, George Wallace was one of the Southern governors that stood fast in support of segregation, proving that the federal government needed to get involved, even though it didn't necessarily say that constitutionally they had an overwhelming right to do that. But because he was willing to support segregation, obviously that continued to conflict with the 15th Amendment, which allows African Americans the right to vote, and also the 14th Amendment, which allows equal rights that can only be taken away through due process. Simply because segregation existed as a past practice was not a good enough reason to say that due process had been used to take away the rights of African Americans. And then, of course, there are implied powers. These are specifically hinted at basically within the Constitution. So these would be powers that aren't necessarily spelled out, but they are hinted at within the Constitution. For instance, the Supreme Court is set up as the highest court in the land, so who better to interpret the law in reference to the Constitution? It doesn't actually say in the Constitution that they have the power of judicial review, but it does say that they are the highest court in the land. So they are able to use the power of judicial review, even though that isn't specifically spelled out in the Constitution. Or the fact that they ruled in the case of McCulloch versus Maryland that the federal bank at the time, the Bank of the United States, could not be taxed by the state of Maryland because that was a state government and the federal government has national supremacy. Once again, it doesn't talk about banks or how to resolve those differences in the Constitution, but the court ruled in favor of the federal bank. And then there's also enumerated powers. These powers are specifically listed in the Constitution that give certain powers to the federal government in particular. And then there's the elastic clauses. These are clauses like to protect the general welfare. Well, that's pretty broad. That could cover pretty much anything. And so some people advocate that that gives the right for the national government to step into situations like civil rights and take charge. And then, of course, now there's the question about immigration, because the Supremacy Clause basically gives the right for the federal government to control that. But obviously, some states, especially those on the southern border, have a vested interest in protecting their own citizens. So, how much should they get involved? And then there's commerce power. Congress has the ability to protect foreign and interstate commerce. In the case of Gibbons versus Ogden in 1824, one party is given a federal charter to operate steamboats in the waters off New York City, and then another party is given a state charter to do the same thing. Well, in that case, the Supreme Court ruled that the federal charter, of course, has supremacy. And the reason why Congress has these powers is to promote economic development. We can't have one part of the country experiencing an economic disaster and the others not. And so they have to have level policies that apply to the whole nation to support things like infrastructure and trade. Also, regulating economic activity. There's an argument, especially in the case of pollution, why the federal government should have national supremacy, because one state has lots of air pollution and maybe doesn't care about it, but that pollution is obviously going to float over other states. And then, of course, over the years, the federal government has obviously increased its responsibilities and increased its power. But there are those that argue for the federal system to work properly, more of that has to be shared with the states. And so there are some issues maybe where the federal government at one time had more control over, but they have ceded some of that back over to the states, especially when it comes to issues, for instance, like welfare. Some programs were set up to be implemented by the federal government, but then over the time, because of the pressure to commit to the federal system, some of those responsibilities, like giving out money for Medicaid, for instance, or for food stamps, or SNAP as it's called, eventually were redistributed or increased the responsibilities for the states to handle. And then, of course, in the fifth article of the Constitution, gives the states the power to help out with amendments. But before that, in the Fourth Amendment, it specifically talks about setting up new states, citizenship, and of course, the fact that states must give each other full faith and credit. In other words, if you get a driver's license and you're driving across the country, you don't have to get a new license every state that you go through. You do if you are moving to that state, but otherwise our papers, our recognitions, all those other kinds of things, if we're just traveling through, we don't have to get new sets each time. And the same is true of marriage, and that was one of the issues involved in the Defense of Marriage Act in 1996. It basically set it up so that marriage was defined as between a man and a woman. Congress does have the right to step in and clarify a state issue like marriage, for instance, by passing a law like that. Now, there are some who say, no, that's not the case, and it's something that's still completely carried out by the state governments, the federal government, even after they pass this law. They don't have anything to do with marriage at all, so some believed it was unconstitutional. And of course, this eventually became a moot point when it was viewed that marriage between same-sex couples was allowed as a matter of equal rights under the 14th Amendment. And then, of course, extradition. This is something that happens when one country requests a suspect or prisoner be turned over to them from another country. Well, just like the states are kind of like mini countries, we have to file extraditions. For instance, if Pennsylvania wants a prisoner or suspect from Montana, we have to file extradition paperwork in order to get them. Now, that happens almost 100% of the time. And then, of course, there are certain privileges and immunities that each state has. These privileges and immunities that each state has Basically are things that all citizens are entitled to. So if you're traveling to another state, you don't have a special set of laws that just applies to you. So which clause of the Constitution requires states to honor contracts signed in other states? That would be full faith and credit. And intergovernmental regulations or relations, from dual to cooperative federalism, devolution, which is shifting power downward or turning more over to individual parts of the country, and then fiscal federalism concentrates just on the money involved in government power and how it's shared. Dual federalism is when there's separate spheres of authority, or kind of like a layer cake, if you can imagine that graphed out in your mind. So basically, in that sense, national power, the federal power, is interpreted quite narrowly, and it's funneled down throughout the rest of the system to the states and local government. Cooperative federalism is when there's a shared cost, though, where there are federal guidelines that states must follow, and there's also shared administration. For instance, with Medicare, there's obviously a national Medicare office and employees, but then they distribute the money and it goes to states, and each of those states has their own offices dealing with Medicare. Interstate highways is a good example of this. There is a National Department of Transportation, and Congress gives money to it, its budgets for interstate highways, but then they divvy that out to the individual state departments like PennDOT in order to maintain those roads. Cooperative federalism, of course, also exists in areas like schools. Department of Education gives us money for busing, gives us money for special education, gives us money for food. And that money gets given to the states, and the states parses it out to the local government. And also things, of course, as I just mentioned, highway and state alcohol law, that goes along with the Department of Transportation. The fact that they give money to states for transportation means that the states must also agree to follow certain laws. For instance, all of them have basically made the same law that you must wait to drink until you're 21 years of age, for instance. That was only put into place because the federal government said if you want to continue to get money, this regulation has to exist. And of course, there's a party divide on federalism. Democrats favor national government, Republicans favor state governments. In the 1930s, 1940s, the parties switched positions because they used to be the opposite, because the Confederacy was mostly made up of Democrats and they favored state government. So this position has changed in the parties over time. And of course, Ronald Reagan, probably one of the more famous Republican presidents of the 20th century, favored devolution, loosening federal regulations, allowing states more leeway. The 1994 Congress, which was a majority taken by Republicans in both the House and the Senate, also favored this process. And harnessing federal government power for specific actions and then funneling it out to the states became the preferred manner. And most of this, of course, when you look at it, is done through money or fiscal federalism. The grant system. Categorical grants have a specific purpose. They can cross over to different areas. They have different requirements that can also cut over different areas. There are project grants, which are meant for specific programs. There are formula grants, which involve basically metrics. So certain people or certain cities or certain programs at the state and local level have to meet certain numbered qualifications in order to get those. And then there are block grants, which was heavily favored by the 1994 Congress. The 1994 Congress favored devolution, and so they preferred block grants, money from the central government handed out to state and local governments. Of course, when this happens, it puts a lot of pressure on the state and local governments to lobby or ask for that money to make sure they get those grants. And sometimes, of course, when the federal government gives money, they say in order to accept this, you must follow these rules or laws. But following those, especially in the long run, actually ends up costing you more money. So you might often hear the phrase unfunded mandate. Well, we took money at one time and the government says we have to do this, but now they're not giving us additional money to continue to follow these certain guidelines. Here you can see this chart that displays fiscal federalism. federal grants to state and local governments over time. One famous example would be the No Child Left Behind Act, which has been readjusted and renamed. Which of the following gives states more discretion in using federal funds? That would be block grants. And of course, diversity in policy. Throughout the country, different states, different groups of people are going to have different opinions about what should be done. When you do decentralize power, it allows different groups in different places to then implement the best solutions they have for whatever problems that may occur that specifically impact them. So policy innovation, creativity, imagination is better facilitated when you have power distributed. If you just have central power with one specific group of people making all the decisions, there's less imagination, less innovation. But diversity has its downside because you end up with thousands of different programs, thousands of different rules and guidelines throughout the country about health, about transportation, and so it can get very confusing. One example would be education. We have the ability to come up with our own solutions here in Titusville or other local areas to meet our students' needs. That's a good thing. The downside is, though, that not all schools or local governments can be trusted to do the right thing. Some of them just decide to ignore it. Civil rights would be an example of that when it comes to schools. State and local governments at the school district level during segregation were completely willing to go along with it. So because there was a diversity in power sharing, that actually hurt the rights of the diverse population. So there's both good and bad. And which of the following is a result of federalism? All of the above. Diverse policies in states. States can be policy innovators. States can spend less on education. There you can see an example of that. All kinds of variations in how much is spent on education throughout the country, and it's not even necessarily in just one pocket, although you do get some of the highest ranges in the Northeast. But you can see the other colors are distributed throughout the country. Because of federalism, it decentralizes politics. Not all the decision making is in one place. Disputes can be resolved at lower levels of government that best fit the cultural and diverse needs of those people. Majorities can be heard at the state level. So within a state, of course, the bulk of public opinion can win. There's more opportunities for participation because now you can participate in 3 different levels of government, and you also have a bigger voice within your smaller community. And losing elections is less painful because one party might sweep one particular level of government, another party might sweep the other, and you can have a bigger impact. So losing elections isn't as bad. And then, of course, one of the problems with the federal system is that it gives a lot of power to smaller, less populated states. It also gives more power to rural areas. And so that's a criticism of more densely populated communities. The Electoral College is an example of that. North Dakota has an incredibly small portion of the population. Their electoral vote is only 3, but that's a much bigger percentage of the electoral vote than they have as a percentage of the population. So that's not necessarily the most democratic. And thwarting national majorities. There are probably a lot of people and a lot of states that would like to change the electoral college system, but the small, less populated states are never going to want to do that. And so even if 90% of the rest of the country wants it, if those remaining states that make up more than a quarter of the state legislatures refuse to change it, it's not going to happen. And here you can see the number of governments in America. 1 national government, 50 state governments, 3,033 county governments, over 19,000 municipalities like towns or cities, cities or boroughs, towns or townships that are rural, about 16,519, over 13,000 school districts, over 37,000 special districts like water commission districts where they're implementing certain drinking water and water sewage systems. There's all kinds of special districts that can be made. Why the national government grew. Economic intervention during the Great Depression. Industrialization caused, of course, concerns over pollution and safety. And there are all kinds of other instances where the federal government has gotten more involved. They have implemented quotas, for instance, a number of things that need to be done in an industry. Subsidies, money that's given to industries or even state and local governments. Laws preventing monopolies. That was a concern also for the national government about stopping one company from having such large control it would stifle competition. And then health and safety. This was another problem. There was a patchwork of health and safety. Some states didn't care at all. Others had more strict regulations. But at the same time, businesses didn't want to go there. So those states said, look, we want to protect our people, but at the same time, businesses won't come here, so that's not fair. And so the national government also got involved with that, particularly with the agency known as OSHA. And urbanization. Cities growing in a lot of different states needed help with housing and social welfare programs to address poverty, domestic abuse, crime, all these other types of issues. So there you can see the total spending is the blue line for all levels of government. Federal government is red, state and local government is green. Federalism has contributed to democracy in all the following ways, except the Electoral College. That's not exactly a democratic institution. So just to go through some of the state and local government. State and local governments have been characterized by revitalization and diversity since the 1960s. States have become more active players in policymaking because of especially those block grants and the devolution of power. They have been more involved. States still remain diverse in their populations and policies, rural, urban, mostly European descent, mostly minority descent. There's all kinds of differences that occur throughout the entire country. State constitutions, they have their own, and in general, each state has a unique one. They, of course, are subordinate to the U.S. Constitution thanks to the 6th Article. State constitutions have more detail about specific policies. Most of them are much longer than the United States Constitution. It is argued that specific interests work to protect their issues in the Constitution since it is harder to amend theirs. And if you wanted to zoom in on this, there you can see the Texas State Constitution. The Texas system often brags about their governors, but their governors are incredibly weak. And how you can tell that is the more executives you have, especially those that are elected, the less powerful the governor is. And Texas has a number of elected executives, so the governor doesn't actually have that much power altogether. So that's how the constitutions can differ. Few states rewrite their constitutions. States often use cut and paste methods of changing their constitutions by only updating a few sections of the document at a time. In general, state legislatures propose a constitution amendment and then is put to a vote for election. In Pennsylvania, it has to be proposed by 2 sets of state legislatures, so they have to pass it more than once, and then it goes to the voters. Some states do allow citizen initiative, so they can start a referendum vote where they are the ones that begin the amending process. Gubernatorial elections are for governors. Elections are generally held in even-numbered non-presidential election years. For instance, Pennsylvania, it's held 2 years after the leap year. So the next governor's election will be in 2022, and then 4 years later in 2026. The elections are expensive, and candidates raise most of the money themselves, same as the presidency. State legislatures have small constituencies, yet the least well-known. State districts have to be redrawn after the court case in 1962, Bakers versus Carr. Because before that, a lot of states would give more representative to rural areas and very few to cities. But the Supreme Court ruled that that was unfair and unconstitutional. They basically came up with the phrase, one person, one vote, so that every person should have equal representation in the legislature. And even there, campaigns are getting more expensive and more candidate-centered. There's a lot of partisan competition, even when they're, for instance, in Nebraska, their legislature is supposedly nonpartisan, but everybody knows who the Republicans and Democrats are. Legislative turnover. This is one of the concerns. Do people stay too long, or should they have to leave office after a while? Partisan competition is close in most states, often resulting in divided government. Pennsylvania, for instance, in 2020, we have a Republican governor or a Democratic governor and a Republican-controlled state legislature. That often happens in what is called purple states. There's generally high turnover in state legislatures, which some think leads to new policies. And some states like California force that because they have term limits. Some states have decided to force turnover by using those term limits like California. And here's a chart of balance and power, but this is a little bit older. But there you can see it's not, all green or all blue, and some of the states do have split control. Maybe 40 or 50 years ago, most of the state legislatures were made up of men of European descent, but that has been changing, although not as quickly as you might think. There you can see female representation. The yellow, of course, has the highest. Next highest would be brown. But there you can see there are some states, there's still 3, for instance, that have less than 8% female representation. The job of the governor, he's expected to fill many duties. Basically, they're like mini presidents. But as I showed you earlier, Texas has a lot less power. Pennsylvania's governor is considered one of the more powerful ones. Some governors have line item vetoes, which are controversial because instead of vetoing the entire bill, the governor can go through and cross out some sections. The state of Wisconsin had one of the most creative line item vetoes, where the governor can actually cross out individual letters in the bill, spelling new words and changing the entire definition of it. And just like presidents, they use personal power, they use the media, they use the fact that they're the center of the attention to establish some of their policy goals. So there you can see the very strong governors are mostly in the Northeast, but also Utah, including Pennsylvania. Weak governors are throughout the South, but also some in the West. Here they have Texas labeled as moderate, although that's kind of generous. There are many other elected executives. Lieutenant governor is kind of like a mini vice president. The attorney general, which is the chief law enforcement officer. Treasurer is obviously in charge of the money. Secretary of State in Pennsylvania is appointed, but in some states they can be elected. They are basically in charge of helping to administer the government and continue relations. An auditor is like an inspector. State legislatures generally operate like Congress. They have committees. They go by seniority. They split between parties, and each of the parties elects leaders. Many of them do have longer sessions. Many of them do have higher salaries, and the point of that, of course, is to try to get as many people to run as possible instead of just wealthy people, because if you didn't pay them, only the rich would run. Also being given more staff, so that way they can research and ask better questions when laws are proposed. But others argue that this is taken away from the fact that average people who just do this for part-time and only put in a few hours, otherwise known as the citizen legislature, and they say that's harmed that and that's helped go away. Some states still have this. Some states still do have a part-time legislature, or they only work so many hours a year, and they don't get paid that much, and they don't really have a staff, so they can just show up, talk about the bills, and vote on them and go. That might seem great, and that opens it up to even more people being able to do it, but at the same time, how good are these laws passed and how much expertise is there? And there you can see state legislatures. Pennsylvania has one of the professional legislatures. The red ones are those that are incredibly part-time, little or no staff, little or no pay. And the green ones, of course, are somewhere in between that. The state court systems are quite different from state to state, and there's been no real effort to try to consolidate them or make them better. Many states have established intermediate courts of appeal to take some kind of workload off the state Supreme Court. We do have a state Supreme Court with 7 justices that are elected for 10 years. The intermediate courts in Pennsylvania are called the Commonwealth Court, which hears appeals of cases that just involve the government. And there's also the Superior Court, which hears all other ones, criminal and civil case. The general trial courts are the court of common pleas that exist within each of our county seats. That's where the courtroom action, like on Law and Order, would happen. And then the lowest level are called magistrates in Pennsylvania. They deal with minor crimes and citations and arraigning people when they're arrested. This also varies selection of judges from state to state. There are elections do occur in Pennsylvania. They are partisan, but they're not allowed to talk about political issues when they campaign. Some states do appoint, but that's not the case in Pennsylvania. And here they're elected for 10-year terms at all levels. There's also some push for reform based on merit instead, but that hasn't really taken off much yet. And here you can see we're listed under the partisan elected situation for judges. Some states allow proposed changes to laws to be put on the ballot. That is rare or non-existent in Pennsylvania. Referendums are used by most states to let voters disapprove or approve of state legislation. Here, that just happens mostly with constitutional amendments. A few states allow voters to vote someone out of office or recall them, fire them basically. That's difficult to do in Pennsylvania. There is no guide for a state and its local government. They have to create that on their own. Dillon's rule, local governments have only those powers and duties explicitly given to them by the state. Some states allow home rule, where a local government adopts a charter like a constitution. There's only a few municipalities in the state of Pennsylvania that have this. There are counties. In Pennsylvania, there are 67. In Louisiana, they're called parishes. In Alaska, boroughs. Townships are smaller rural areas like Oil Creek Township or Allegheny Township. Municipalities are boroughs or cities where there's a more concentrated population. Some parts of the country, they have town meetings where everybody shows up to vote and speak about things. That mostly happens in New England. In most of Pennsylvania, we have a mayor-council system where either the mayor acts like a mini president and can veto and sign laws and lead the police department, or like in Titusville, the mayor is part of city council and just presides over the meetings. That's referred to as a weak mayor system. And then in most places, they also have a manager. In Titusville, a manager is the one that runs the day-to-day operations. Some cities have a commission where it's a board that has executive power. And then, of course, there are school districts and special districts. School districts in Pennsylvania, we elect 9 board members in odd-numbered years, and we stagger them, 5 in one year, 4 in the other. And special districts, like I mentioned before, can be for things like water commissions or nature or stuff like that. And there you have some more numbers about local governments. And here's how the system of a mayor-council government works. This is the one that Titusville uses on the bottom, the weak mayor government. So obviously there's a lot of different local governments. There's not much cooperation among them. Unfortunately, it probably would be a good idea if local governments pooled police and firefighter services. We have a real hard time finding volunteer fire services throughout the rural areas, so it would probably be best for them to cooperate with Titusville and contribute, pay a certain fee to receive services from the fire department, or perhaps the city to take over the rural fire departments and make those paid positions too. But that's difficult to resolve because nobody wants to give up power and nobody wants to pay for things. Regional governments are able to coordinate some activities in some areas, but that's rare. Difference in opinion on needs and competition make cooperation difficult. COGs can coordinate some activities as well. And these COGs, or councils of government, can help resolve problems, but the real difficulty is setting them up in the first place. And there you can see state and local finance policy, both revenues on the left and expenditures on the right. You can see a large amount of the revenues come from taxes, but it doesn't make up the majority. And then you can see from expenditures, well, basically sharing money with other governments makes up a huge chunk of their expenditures. Also, health and social services takes up a big chunk of that as well. So, state and local government is an example of democracy at the subnational level. States have been willing to let local governments be created to handle local problems and operate very openly. There are problems with the lack of voter participation. Even though local government impacts our lives more than any other level, it has some of the lowest voter turnout. Local primary elections have sometimes less than 10%, which is ridiculous. State and local governments are growing faster than the national government, adding more and more services all the time to deal with changing populations. Some states have sunset legislation that calls for reviewing of agencies to see if their programs are still needed, which is probably a good thing so you don't have redundancy or programs that no longer work. Some local governments are better able at policymaking than their states, especially because even within states, you can have vastly different local communities. So, just in a nutshell, the federal system shares between those three levels. And in each of those three levels, you can find executive, legislative, and judicial to varying degrees. They share power through this federal system, which has both pros and cons. And one of the problems, of course, of local government is it's not paid enough attention to.